The lessons came quickly, simple at first. Don't tell anyone. This is our secret. No one will believe you, anyways. Each command adding another brick to the wall of silence being built around my voice, my truth, my very self. I learned that quiet meant safe, still meant survival, silent meant maybe they'd leave me alone. Let's understand something about forced silence. It starts as survival, your mind's way of protecting you. It feels like safety, because for a time, it is. It becomes identity. You forget who you were before it, until one day you realize silence isn't protecting you anymore, it's imprisoning you. I became an expert at silence, could disappear in a crowded room, could make myself so small, so quiet, even my breath seemed too loud. Silence became my art form, my expertise, my shield against a world that felt too dangerous for truth. But here's what no one tells you about silence: it grows. Like a cancer, it spreads. From one secret you can't tell to a lifetime you can't speak about. From one truth you have to hide to an entire self you have to bury. I lived in that prison for years, became comfortable there, made my home in the quiet spaces between what happened, what I could say, between who I was and who I was to pretend to be. But God had other plans. It happened in a counselor's office. Nothing dramatic, no big revelation, just a simple question: how are you? Three words I'd answered thousands of times with the usual, I'm okay. But that day was different. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the silence had grown too heavy. Maybe God had prepared this exact moment. Whatever it was, instead of I'm okay, truth slipped out. I'm not okay. Something happened. Breaking silence starts small: a whispered truth, a quiet admission, a tiny crack in the wall. Because truth, like water, only needs the smallest opening to begin breaking through. That first truth in the counselor's office, it was like a pebble starting an avalanche. One small word leading to another, then another, until truth began pouring out. Messy, painful, powerful truth. But here's what surprised me: my voice was rusty, weak. Speaking felt foreign, dangerous even, like stepping onto ice, never sure if it would hold or crack beneath me. Voice after silence is like learning to walk again. It starts shaky, it gains strength gradually, needs safe space to practice, grows with support, becomes stronger through use. Healing from long silence requires acknowledging the cost, grieving what was lost, embracing new truth, building fresh patterns. Pain became purpose, wounds became wisdom, silence becomes strong, loss becomes legacy, shame becomes strength. To everyone listening who's carrying silence, your story matters, your voice has power, your truth deserves to be heard. And you're not alone anymore, because once truth starts speaking, silence loses its power to bind. Welcome back to the Shattering the Silence podcast. I am your host, Monica, and let's get to the agenda for today. I want to start by reading a letter that I received from a listener. Just have to get it here. And it actually perfectly aligns with what we're going to discuss today. So it says, Dear Monica, I listened to the first episode of your podcast, Shattering the Silence. Sorry. Shattering the Silence. And I've never had my hand shake so much as it does now writing this letter. When you shared your story of childhood trauma for the first time, I was hearing someone speak truths I've kept, locked away for so long. I'm 34 now, but I was sexually abused by my uncle from ages 7 to 12. I've never told anyone except my therapist. I have a successful career in marketing, a husband who loves me, and two beautiful children. From the outside, everything looks perfect, but inside, I feel shattered into a million pieces. After hearing your story in that first episode, I've begun gathering courage to write to you. There was something about the way you spoke about your experience, even though you didn't give much detail, that made me feel less alone. Even though you've only released one episode, it's already had such an impact on me. I have questions that keep me up at night, and after hearing your story, I feel like maybe you'll understand. So her questions are, do you ever feel whole again? Right now, I feel like I'm walking around with pieces of myself missing. My husband knows something happened to me, but doesn't know the details. How did you learn to trust someone with your whole story? Sometimes I feel guilty for still struggling with this after so many years. Like I should be over it by now. In your first episode, you touched on your journey, but I love to know, how do you deal with that shame? What do you do on really bad days, the ones where the memories won't stay buried? After listening, I almost told my best friend about what happened. The words were right there, but I couldn't make them come out. Part of me is still that little girl keeping the secret because she thinks it's her fault. Your courage in sharing your story has sparked something in me. Maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. Maybe there's hope for people like us who are trying to rebuild ourselves after trauma. Thank you for starting this podcast. Thank you for being brave enough to speak first. I'll be listening to every episode, hoping to find more pieces of myself in your words. With gratitude, listener from Boston. And she asked me not to even share her first name. She's not ready for that yet. But need you to know how much your first episode mattered. Okay, that was the only letter I received over the past week, and I just received it the other day. And so I do want to address her questions. And although I didn't receive other letters, I did receive other questions, not as many as last week, and we'll go over those as well before we get into what I want to talk about today. So her first question to me was, um, do you ever feel whole again? She said right now she feels like she's walking around with pieces of herself missing. And so yes, you do feel whole again. It did take a while. So I can say that my journey to healing did start in pieces. It didn't just one day I woke up and said, "Oh, I'm healed." It didn't happen that way. The way that it happened was there were little things that happened in life that made me realize that, okay, Monica, you have to deal with this because this is impacting other areas of your life. And those other areas we are going to talk about in future episodes. And so at this stage, I can say, yes, I feel whole again. I no longer allow what happened to me to define and identify who I am. I've been able to recognize when, okay, this is an area that needs healing, that needs to be addressed, and I go ahead and seek out whatever I need to do to get that healing. The thing is, healing comes in different ways. You don't have to automatically think that, okay, if I go to my therapist, then I'll be healed. If I talk to this person or if I journal. No, healing comes in different ways for different people. And you don't have to try to use the same method that I had to go through or the same method for each thing because it's going to depend on what it is that you're seeking healing of. Is it the fact that you don't trust? Is it that maybe you watch a certain television show and you're triggered, so now you're thinking that you're not whole, and that doesn't mean that. It just means that you're relating to that event on television that's taking place, and yes, it may bring back memory, but there are healthy ways to deal with the memory. So yes, there is hope. There is always hope. There is healing. There is a way to feel whole again. And those of you are listening, if you have any kind of feedback for listener from Boston, please go ahead and put that in the comments. We all have stories we can share and things that worked for us. But that was her first question. Do you ever feel whole right now? And I can tell you this, listener from Boston, I also felt that I was walking around with pieces of myself missing. One of the reasons why I felt that way, because I felt that I always had to wear a mask, even up until my adult years. I felt that I had to wear a mask and I couldn't show who I really was. And so that meant that Monica, myself, my true self, my authentic self, was missing because I was not able to give people truly who Monica was, nor did I feel that I could share what happened to me, which kind of goes to one of your other questions. The other one was my husband knows something happened to me, but doesn't know the details. How did you learn to trust someone with your whole story? I tested the waters. I watched body language. I sometimes would ask questions in hope that somebody would say, well, Monica, why are you asking me this? Did something happen? It didn't happen that way, by the way. I it took, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I really give you the truth of how I was able to tell my entire story. Yes, I would tell people bits and pieces, and based on their responses to me, I took some things away. Either they weren't ready to hear such a tragic story, or they didn't know how to deal with it, or maybe I triggered something within them because that is a possibility that you may be trying to share something with someone who has not yet shared their story. And so, not in a mean way, but by you sharing your story, it caused something in them to be stirred up so they're not ready to talk about your story if they haven't yet spoken about their story. And so I was able to tell my whole story. If you remember from the episode last week, I mentioned how I spoke with a therapist. I finally said, no, I'm not okay. Something happened. And I was able to tell that story, that entire story. That particular therapist did ask me, don't you feel you need help with this? Don't you feel you need to speak with someone more about this? What about your church community? And what about this? What about that? And he did try to dig out even more to assist me with my healing journey. But if you remember from last week's episode, I also said that even though I was able to tell him what happened, I didn't feel that he was the one to walk me through my journey. And that's okay. But the way that I was able to tell somebody my whole story is I tested the waters with certain people, and it is okay. It's okay if somebody is not able to deal with your story, as long as they're not mistreating you, which I don't believe people will do. They just may not know how to handle it, and so they don't want to mishandle it. But that's how I learned to tell somebody my entire story. Tested the waters, and then one day went to see a therapist about something totally different. My reason for actually going to a therapist had nothing to do with why I was really there. But while I was there, I just felt there was like an overwhelm of emotion, and that particular thing came back up to me. I don't know, maybe I was just tired of the weight of holding that secret. The next question was, hang on. Sometimes I feel guilty for still struggling with this after so many years. Like I should be over it by now. In your first episode, you touched on your journey, but I'd like to know, how do you deal with that shame? So I want to first address the being over it by now. No one could tell you when you can be over your trauma. No one should minimize what happened to you by saying, just get over it. I noticed you put it in quotes, so I'm thinking that maybe, listener from Boston, somebody has said that to you. I have had people tell me you need to get over it when dealing with some of the manifestations of the trauma. So they may not have known about my trauma that I've experienced over the years, but the way I was manifesting some of the behaviors I was um, participating in, whether emotionally or actual physical behaviors, they would say, just get over it. No one could tell you when to get over it. It is not something you can just get over. It literally is a process. It's a process of healing. And you have to make sure you're taking the necessary steps to obtain that healing. Now, I want to say this. I didn't get healed when I was younger. I didn't get healed when I was a teenager. Didn't get healed when I was a young adult. My healing came years and years, decades later, um, when I was able to recognize that some of my behaviors, the root cause was because of the trauma in my life. And when I began my healing process, yes, I could then I was better able to handle things. So from the time that I was a child, from the time that I was a teenager, from the time that I was a young adult and an adult, I carried shame. And shame is heavy. I was afraid to really show who Monica truly is. I was afraid to be who I really wanted to be. And I began to people please. I began to adjust so that people would continue to be in relationship with me or that they would receive me. And that deals with rejection and abandonment, which I have an episode for that as well. And the reason why I began to adjust, because I always felt if they really knew what was going on, if they really knew what happened to me, if they really knew some of the decisions I made in my life, if they really knew the behaviors, then they would no longer be my friend or they would no longer be in my circle. And so that is shame. It is, I am too ashamed to let people know what I've done. Therefore, I am going to wear a mask. I am going to put on this facade. And for years, I mean, years and years and years, this is what it was. I had a friend, a good friend of mine, reach out to me after she watched the first podcast. And I've known her since, I'm going to say, since I was like 6 or 7 years old. So you're talking someone I've known for almost 50 years. And what she said, she sent a text, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact word. But what her text says basically, I am learning Monica. And she was right, not in a bad way. But when I did speak with her the other day, we began talking about it a little more. And she would say, looking back, I could see we always thought of you as the tough one. We always thought of you as the hard one, the strong one, whatever it was. But, in her conversation, what I picked up was that she now sees that that truly wasn't who I was. And that was just something I was putting on because I felt I had to. It was something that I put on for protection. And that goes into what we're going to discuss in a bit. So, the shame, you deal with it in certain ways, and sometimes you don't deal with it in healthy ways. For me, I wasn't dealing with it in healthy ways, but as you begin to share your story, you won't you won't have that shame. This same friend actually said to me the other day when we were talking, Monica, you're going to have to get used to people saying certain things to you now that the truth is coming out. And she's right. And my response to her was, I don't care. I don't care what people say. Now, I had to get there. Even while I was going through the process of healing, it did bother me when people would say certain things, or if they heard about certain things that I've done in my past, they would have a certain look or their body language would read a certain way. But now, I don't have that issue anymore. I don't have that challenge anymore. I understand that people are going to behave or believe whatever it is, of whatever way they want to behave towards what I've done and what I've spoken. And that's their story. That is something I'm going to allow them to deal with, but it's not going to stop me from shattering the silence. And, more importantly, that's more of the reason why we have to begin to shatter the silence. Because one of the things that I've learned is a lot of people who wants to frown or turn their nose up at you because of something you may have said or something you may have done in the past, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it's because they are also holding on to secrets that they've not let go. So we forgive them, of course. We don't hold it against them. We pray for them. We wish them well. But anyone who wants to continue to speak down to you about your experience or anything that you've said is not a healthy person for you to have in your life right now. And that's okay. It's called setting boundaries. And so that was oh no, that wasn't the last question. The last question was, what do you do on the really bad days, the ones where the memories won't stay buried? So part of this I'm going to talk about next week when we talk about forgiveness. And I won't say that the story of trauma, or my story, not the story, but my story of trauma doesn't come back to me sometimes. Comes back to me often, especially now as I'm putting together the episodes, as I'm studying for the episode to get the information out to you. Of course, the stories come back. And you will hear more stories from me that I wish it was just childhood trauma that I could say, oh, that happened when I was much younger, but there were other episodes of trauma that took place in my life, even in my teenage years, that I will get into. When those times come up, I have to do a quick assessment of what it is that I'm feeling. I do allow myself to feel, if that makes sense. I allow myself to feel because I have to acknowledge what it is that I'm feeling. If I try to suppress it, then that means I'm not yet healed. And so what I do is, again, I take inventory and I acknowledge, why am I feeling this way? What's going on? Again, as I'm preparing for these episodes, as I'm studying, as I'm, you know, I am a woman of faith. So as I pray about the episodes, these things come back to me. But they come back to me in a way in which it's given me another angle of the story that I would need to speak, that silence that I would need to shatter. Um, there are some days where I look at a TV show. I was going to name the show, but I'm not going to do that. I look at a TV show and I begin to analyze what happens in the show. So while I'm analyzing what's happening in that television show, it brings me back to what happened to me. For someone who has not yet told their story and they're dealing with things from the past, one of the most practical things that I could tell you to do, since you haven't spoken your story yet, and that is okay, but one of the most practical things that I tell people to do is to journal. Journal your thoughts, get it out some kind of way, because our bodies tend to hold on to that stress. You may be wondering why you're always sick. You may be wondering why you're always feeling a certain way. It is because your body carries the stress. It's because you're not releasing something, and you don't want that to stay on you. So like I said, one of the most practical things that you can do when these stories come up, when these thoughts come up, is to go ahead and take some time to journal. Yes, that helped me a great deal. And that is her last question. Again, if anyone has any kind of feedback, let's be gentle in the comments. I do review the comments. I don't have a problem deleting the comments that I feel are not appropriate. Let's be empathetic. Let's show some compassion. But if you have some feedback for listener from Boston, please go ahead and put it in the comments. So here are some other questions that I received last week. Not as many as it was before, but here are some of the questions. So the first one, what would you say to your younger self about the journey ahead? So to this person, what I will say is I created an intro video, and the video is called Dear Little Monica, and it is a letter that I'm reading to myself as I am today. but I'm reading it to Monica before she has gone through the childhood trauma, and I'm letting her know what's going to take place. Doesn't go into a lot of detail. It's about maybe 3 minutes long. I don't remember, but it's the intro video on this page. So go ahead and look at that. Again, it's called Dear Little Monica. What's the hardest part about carrying trauma silently? How did trauma affect different areas of your life? So, the hardest part about carrying trauma silently was the weight of it, the burden of it, and not being able to be my true, authentic self. And, I do have to apologize to the people who have known me over the years who think that they knew Monica. They really didn't. They knew the Monica who was prideful, they knew the Monica who was um it was a facade, it was a mask. I didn't give you my true self because I was afraid if I'm being if sorry, I'm trying to see where that glare is coming from. It was a facade. I wasn't being my true self. um So that's the hardest part about carrying something in silence. You're actually being someone that you truly are not because you haven't released that part of you. And once you release that part of you, you are now able to be a bit more gentler. You're able to be softer. So to go back to what my friend said, well, you were always the hard one. She's right. And I was hard up until my adult years. You can go to one of my friends now and they're going to say, yeah, that's Monica. She's hard. She could take anything. She's strong. Well, that's not true. I can tell you that now. That's not true. That was a facade. Um, how did trauma affect different areas of your life? I don't want to go into too much of an answer for that simply because literally the after next week, after we talk about forgiveness, I'm literally going to tackle how trauma affected the different areas of my life and the some of the choices that I made that were not the best choices. Some of them were good, most of them were not so good. I don't want to um, answer that now. I just say stay tuned because I will answer that. The last few questions from how do you handle the moments when trauma feels fresh again, even years later? So I kind of addressed that when I was responding to the listener from Boston. You have to literally find out why you are feeling the way that you're feeling. Are you coming from an unhealed place? Or are you coming from something maybe that you've watched something and it triggered a memory? Or is it that you're ready to tell your story and you don't know how? You really have to know why you're having the trauma feelings again. You said why it feels fresh again. Like, are you feeling it from a place where it's almost like it's happening to you again? The reason why you're feeling that way is because you haven't been healed. You haven't sought out healing for those things that you are feeling. And that is very important because sometimes when certain things come up, it will trigger and it's handled differently when you've not yet been able to share your story. And you said even years later, it doesn't matter how long it's been. I have a client, as I mentioned last week, I'm a life coach, and I have a client who is dealing with some of the effects of not ever sharing her story. And it is difficult, but healing comes no matter your age, no matter at what time you start your healing process, healing is available. But again, when those feelings come up, and if you have not yet been able to share your story or you feel you're not yet ready, that's okay, but I would recommend the most practical way is to have a journal and write out those feelings, get them out some kind of way. And again, you can always reach out to me at coachmdcam@outlook.com, or if you think it's easier to remember, Shattering the Silence podcast at outlook.com, and I could help you through your journey. What are some practical things you do when you feel triggered or when old wounds surface? I am a journaler. I write. I tend to write out everything. I have so many journals, and for me, the journal is a way for me to get my feelings out when I'm not speaking with my therapist, not speaking with a friend. I journal. I am a woman of faith, so I will pray, I will read my Bible, I will do any of those things to make sure that I'm processing what I'm feeling in a healthy way. It is important that you find things that also will help you process things in a healthy way. Um, for anybody, though, journaling is key. If you're not a writer, because somebody wrote to me, this was quite some time ago. Somebody wrote to me one time and they said, "Well, I'm not a writer." What I could recommend, I don't know if you'll do it, but on your phone, you know how you have that recording, that voice note you could leave. Then begin to talk to yourself through the voice note and then play it back if you're able to listen to it. Again, ultimately, you will need to get healed. You will need to get some healing. But those are practical things where I'm able to get at least the feeling out during the times when I'm feeling it the most. And I do that not just for trauma, I do that for any time I'm feeling something about anything. I am a journaler, so that helps me a great deal. So thank you for that. I have my iPad here because I took some notes that I may want to reference. Things were coming to me even as early as this morning. So I want to make sure that I um, don't miss anything as I'm led to. So I went over the letter already. So I want to talk about your life in a cave. As you know, for some of you that maybe my friends on Facebook, you see I recently posted something about the Cave of Adullam. And as I posted that, I was posting it because what I'm calling in my wilderness season. And in the cave, though, it's a story about a king called David, a named David, not called David, a name. And he was someone who had to find himself hiding in the cave. He was literally running for his life. And he was running for his life from somebody who was trying to take his life. So, and he realized that he needed shelter. He needed a place to hide. You can imagine how weary he was. Everything was happening to him at that time. And he ran into what it was called the Cave of Adullam. And as I began to think about the story, because when I was meditating on that particular story, I wasn't meditating on it because of the podcast. I was meditating on it for myself. But the more I sat with that story, the more I realized how it mirrors the journey of trauma survivors, especially those of us that um, has experience some kind of abuse, but it can go with any kind of trauma. Mine, just one of the trauma experience I've had happens to be childhood sexual abuse, but it doesn't just mean that. When I was thinking about it, I was thinking about trauma in general. So let's talk about the cave experience for a little bit. Now, David, in this story, he fled because he needed to find a safe place. It was the only safe place he could find at that time. And so I want you to think about that for a moment, about as we dealt with our trauma or as we're dealing with trauma, our caves look different. So think about an actual cave that you may have read about, right? It's not beautiful. I put in my notes here, I'm reading from my notes. It wasn't comfortable, it was dark. It was probably damp when you think about a cave, and it was definitely isolated. So, he was looking for shelter, he was looking for safety. But so to him, going into that cave was safe. It was a place where he could finally breathe, or so he thought. Sometimes that's all we can manage after trauma is going into that cave. But what does that cave look like for us when we're not talking about an actual physical cave? What are some of the caves we build? Silence. We hide in perfectionism. We try to be perfect. We try to be liked. Um, We go into achievement. We always have to achieve. Again, we always have to please others. we we can't even celebrate one success because we're off to the other thing. Believe it or not, part of that can be a trauma response to something that has happened to you, and you feel that achievement is what's giving you your worth. Or we will disappear in busyness. We keep ourselves busy so we don't have to think about things, and sometimes we numb ourselves with whatever we can find. So we can numb ourselves with food. We can numb ourselves with sex. We can numb ourselves with just constantly being in a different world, always into television shows, always on social media. Believe it or not, that is not healthy to always be. You're watching one series after the next, after the next. You become numb to the realities in life because you're so consumed with what you're seeing on television and social media. But those are the different caves. Those are some of the things that I've listed: silence, perfectionism, achievement, busyness, or we numb ourselves with whatever we can find. Food. Some food is our comfort. We begin to become an emotional eater. We begin to eat our pain, and then we wonder why we're not the healthiest. And what you begin to understand is that because we numb ourselves with food, other things begin to happen. And believe it or not, that's again just a manifestation of the trauma that we've dealt with. But you have to understand that although these aren't comfortable places, they feel safe to us. But there's really no safety in it because we're not doing it from the correct motive. We're not doing it from a pure heart. We're doing it from a place of trauma. It's a trauma response. And that is our cave. They're our Adullam. It is the place where we find safety, or our refuge. Um, Sometimes when the world feels dangerous, we feel that we need a place of escape. So we go into these places that I call them sometimes our comfort zones, but they're not really comfortable. They're not even really who we are, but we feel we have to do these things and maintain these things in order to ignore and continue to suppress what's really going on with us. So, what's the reality of cave living? Um, it's isolation. And one of the things that I could say is healing does not come in isolation. Healing comes with community, whether that community consists of one other person, such as your life coach, your therapist, whomever it is that you're speaking to, but it doesn't come in isolation. Now, when the King David was separated. It separates you from everything that was familiar to you. Why? Because it's your cave. You're saying that I have to go here. I have to hide in this place because no one understands me. I am the only one who knows what I'm going through. So we may be physically present. You have to keep that in mind. You may be physically present, but you're isolated because part of you is hidden away. You're not giving yourself or your all to people. You seem a bit unreachable. And believe it or not, a lot of times when you think you're hiding something, you're really not hiding it. People are able to read it, even though they may not know the why. They may say, why are you so distant? There were some of the things that my friends said to me over the years. Why are you so distant? Why is it that you're so sheltered? Why don't you talk so much? Why are you so shy? Why, there were a lot of why questions. And so we can be here, but we're not here, if that makes sense. So we can be present, but we're absent. And so that's part of that isolation. We're walking through life with an invisible wall between us and everyone else. And again, that's a coping mechanism for us. That's a cave. And so the next thing it also represents survival mode. Um, David didn't go to that cave because he wanted to thrive, because he was overcoming. No, he was trying to survive. Literally, there was someone out to take his life. And so that's what trauma does to us. What I put here is, sorry if I can read my own writing, we develop incredible survival skills. We become um, people that we begin to read rooms instantly. We begin to look at things to see what is, look at things and people, I should say. I didn't add people here, I said things, but we begin to read things and people, and we begin to um, develop this sixth sense, if you will, as we scan to determine who's safe for us and who we feel is not safe for us, what's danger and what's not. And sometimes it can even be danger that's not really there, but because we don't trust, because of the trauma we went through, then we're already labeling something as not safe and not trustworthy. But you also have to be able to discern when something is not safe for you. So, like I said earlier, if someone is causing you to feel a certain way, telling you you need to get over it, or causing you to not speak what you feel you need to speak, and they continue to shut you down, that is not a safe person for you at this moment, and you need to kind of set that boundary. Um, So, when we go into these, can I trust? Can I not trust? The way people say it is really supposed to be when we meet somebody or come up against somebody, we're supposed to be able to trust until they gave us reason not to trust. But those of us who have gone through trauma, we tend to not trust until people give us reason to trust. So it's a survival mechanism. And it's not necessarily that we want to be this way. It is because we have learned to be this way. We have learned to become this way because of what happened to us. And then there was a place of gathering of others. So when I was reading that, and I'm going to go over those a little bit, others came to the cave. They were distressed, indebted, and discontented people. They found their way to David. They were all carrying their own pain in some kind of way. They had their own stories. And sometimes, even in our dark places, even in our cave, that we can find community. And I want to speak to something here before I go into that truth. And I'm going to bring up my notes that I took this morning. Be mindful of only wanting to be around people who have also gone through some trauma. Yes, we often look for people who understood or understands our struggle. We want that. We absolutely do, because a lot of times we are misunderstood. But you want to be careful of being around people who are not healed. A lot of times, most times, when you're around people that's not healed, it's not really something that is encouraging your healing, is actually keeping you in a dark space. And the cave is supposed to be a temporary place, right? It's that place where we felt we found refuge and comfort and safety, but it's a cave, it's isolated, it's dark. And when other people come into that cave with you and they're not also looking for healing, then you're all just feeding off one another, and it becomes toxic and unhealthy. So you do want to make sure that you are around people and you allow people in who can promote healing for you. So that is important before I go into this. So I'm going to read some of my notes here that I took about the people who came in the cave with him. So some of the people that came in the cave with him were people that were, I'm sorry. The thing is, I didn't put complete sentences here, but I said that they were indebted, they were distressed, and they were discontent people. And so you have to understand that that's sometimes how we feel. And when I say indebted, I don't mean like indebted like financially. Yes, that could be one of the things that we're dealing with, because sometimes we don't set proper boundaries with anything, with people and with things, and money. Finances could be one of those things that we don't set proper boundaries, and we just spend, 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 spend. Why? Because that also feeds a need within us. But again, I'll get into that. And so let's talk about some of the people, because you may even recognize some of the people in these descriptions. So there were the distress. There were those carrying like overwhelming emotional burdens. Now, I'm sure those of you who have gone through some kind of trauma can relate to that. We go through emotional burdens. We don't understand what happens to us. We sometimes wonder if people will understand us, and that takes on a lot of emotional baggage sometimes. Sometimes we even become needy. And so these are the people that was in the cave, that they were looking for healing. And let's see, you know, we're in our world today, if you think about it, when those, a lot of people deal with anxiety. I used to deal with anxiety about some things too. And it just makes our heart race. Sometimes I think about the listener from Boston who said that her hand was shaking as she was writing the letter. That's a sign of anxiety. It's anxiety because she has heard somebody who can share her story. She wants to get it out because think about what she said. She went to her best friend and was about to say it. It was right there, and she did it. That's a form of anxiety, that emotional stress, that she really wants to get something out. This is this dark secret that she's carrying, and she hasn't even told some of the people that's the closest to her. So, um, and it's because of that, those emotional challenges, I'm going to say those emotional challenges that we go through, that keeps us reliving those moments, honestly, those moments of anxiety that we're feeling, our hearts racing, our hands are shaking, or we're feeling rejected. Those are some of the things that causes us to continue to relive the trauma in our lives. Then we had to um, talk about those in debt. And like I said, those weren't the ones. I'm not talking about money, but what came to mind when I was reading it, those, and I was relating it to the trauma experience. And I said, wow, that would be a good lesson to bring to the podcast. I'm talking about people who were crushed by circumstances, people, circumstances that we feel are beyond our control. We, those that we're drowning in expectations. People have expectations of us. We put on expectations of others, false expectations nonetheless, or the expectations are too high and we simply cannot meet them, or they cannot meet them. So we feel that we're in debt to them because we cannot live up to the expectation, though we continue to try, we continue to try, we continue to try. We people please. We're always trying to strive to obtain that next accomplishment. Why? Because it's something that we feel gives us our worth. So we're indebted to that thing, or we people please, we're indebted to that person, um, because we feel that we have to overcome this way, because we feel less of ourselves. Sometimes we don't give ourselves that value, and we feel that we have to find it in other things or other people, so we're indebted to that. And so um when we're in our caves, we sometimes look at, how can I do the next thing so these people will accept me? How can I do this so that the true me is not exposed? So we're indebted to that. And then there was one, they said it was bitter, and so they were discontent. So um that's where we carry that deep emotional trauma wound. It's grief, it's in our soul, it's really deep in there. And it sometimes feel that it's like the listener from Boston. I thought her letter perfectly went into what I wanted to discuss today, because she said it feels like pieces of her were missing. So what she was in essence saying, that she has a fragmented soul. And those are people who are also in the cave with us. But the story, when I was reading the story of King David, it was really interesting because in that cave, they were able to find one another. And some of you are watching today because you want to have community with people who who understood what you've gone through, understands what you're going through if you're still going through it. You want to be able to share your story. I have people who reached out already. Someone wants to speak about mental health. There was someone who wants to talk about domestic violence. All of these stories that need to come out, we want to make sure that we put voice to the things that a lot of people hide, or what they say, push it under the rug. A lot of people were silenced, they've suppressed it. And I want to get these stories out there. And so in this cave, we seem to find community, and they were able to help one another in this cave. They were able to, David became the leader, of course. But when you're broken, even though your first instinct is to hide, you want to retreat, you want to protect what's left of yourself from further damage. Um, but in that cave, there's also sometimes transformation that takes place. It's in the cave that I realized that I finally had to give voice to my story. I finally had to shatter the silence. Because my soul was so shattered, I had to tell my story. I had to get it out there. I had to get healed. And it's not unfortunate. I was about to say unfortunately, but it's not unfortunately. Healing only comes by speaking. If you take what I said, for example, I said journal, and all you need to do is journal, and all you need to do is journal, and now you're healed. It's not true. Healing comes through speaking, because if all you did was journal and you're still afraid to speak to somebody else about your story, then you're not yet healed. There's another part to that. I understand about boundaries. I understand that everybody's not going to know how to receive your story, but shouldn't stop you from saying it. You just have to use wisdom on who to share. So, who to share with. So, I want you to think about that for a moment. They came to this cave, they found themselves, and they began to heal, because again, a cave isn't meant to last forever. And one of the things I want to say about a cave, it's not the end. It is not who you are. It is a place that you sought to find refuge. You went to find justice and safety, but it was never meant to be a permanent residence. And I'm going to say something. So in the intro, you see, and mind you, although the pictures in the intro wasn't of me, the pictures weren't of me, what was being spoken were my words. And so when I spoke about that prison, a cave will feel like prison if you stay there too long. When you begin to feel that anxiety and that shame, when you begin to people please, when you begin to begin emotional eating, or maybe you go to other things to bring about that comfort, to bring about to ensure that you continue to feel numb about truly what you're feeling, that's a prison. There's one thing to try to find safety and shelter and in the cave, but you eventually have to come out of the cave. Otherwise, that is a prison, and that prison wants to bind you. It wants to continue to keep you there, but you want to be able to break out in freedom. And again, there is hope for that. So for those of you who have experienced trauma, our caves may look like, again, the silence that once protected us. And this, what I'm reading to you are my notes of how my cave looked. So this is my story. It was the silence that protected me, is my cave, or was my cave. It was the behaviors that helped me cope, even though they weren't healthy behaviors. They were walls that kept us safe. I had such a wall. Again, I put myself in my own prison. As much as I wanted people around me, I kept pushing them away. I was big on self-sabotage in relationships. It was the mask that hid my pain. Um, yeah. A lot of this, what I'm pulling out, honestly, is from some old, I didn't necessarily have journals, then some of them were just old notebooks or something I typed online. I mean, on like a Word document and I saved it. And it's sometimes when I read it sometimes, or I go back to my journals from years ago, I could see the growth. I could see where, even though I didn't necessarily call it a cave then, I'm calling it a cave now because I was studying that story of King David, and it was something that really, I was like, wow, this story really speaks to those of us who had some trauma. And the cave serves its purpose, but it's only for a time. It helps us to survive. You're not always supposed to be in survival mode. That in itself becomes tiring. At some point, it has to become a place where you find your way out. As people say, you find that light at the end of the tunnel. So we're not meant to be in the cave forever. We're supposed to find that journey out. And so sometimes, as I said earlier, the journey out may not just be one day I'm coming out of the cave. One day you may decide to come out of the cave, and that's the first step. But sometimes we take a few steps toward that light at the end of the tunnel. And then sometimes we retreat back to safety. So remember when I was answering a question and they asked me how was I able to trust somebody with my full story? I would take a step out. I would try to tell somebody, watch their reaction, and I came back in. Or maybe they reacted the way they were supposed to react, with love, with concern, with care. But because I was still carrying that shame, I would try to avoid them. I would go right back into the cave. Sometimes we gather courage from others who've made the journey. So I can remember speaking with someone who also dealt with some kind of trauma. Maybe the trauma wasn't the exact same. And I was still able to speak with them in a way where, even though the trauma we experienced weren't the same, some of the ways we dealt with it was the same. So I was able to speak with that person, and she helped me come out of my cave. Sometimes we need guides who can help us find the way. So that's part of the journey out of the cave. I tested the waters, but ultimately I was able to tell my entire story to a therapist. And eventually I was able to find a therapist, a long-term therapist. But remember, there are life coaches out there. I am a life coach. If again you want to reach out for just to have a talk, go ahead and reach out. And then sometimes we need to honor the cave for keeping us alive while learning we don't need it anymore. That was very important for me. So when I wrote that last night, sometimes we need to honor the cave. The reason why I say we need to honor it, because we have to remember what it felt like to be in the cave. We don't want to forget our experiences, right? Because now they turn into testimonies of how we've overcome. So we need to honor the cave for because it kept us alive, it kept us safe. But in the cave, it also lets us know that we have to come out. It is that place where we first begin to recognize I'm in the cave and I need healing and I need to come out, because we need to recognize that we don't need to go back into that cave. Now that we know the steps on how to obtain healing, we can just go to those steps without going back into the cave. And so we need to recognize when our bodies try to bring or our minds try to bring us back into the cave. We don't always want to retreat to the cave every time something happens. We don't want to do that. We want to be able to navigate the crossroads in life in a healthy manner. So we have to understand the season. So this is one of the things I want you to know as I am about to wrap up here. Um, for those of you who are listening to this podcast and you're still in your silent season and you're still in your cave season, it's valid. You retreated there for real reasons. I understand. That's my next point. It's understandable. You need protection. I understand. It's temporary. even if temporary means years. I was in my cave for years, years. Do not allow anybody to rush your healing because it is your journey and you have to take it at your pace. Because sometimes when we try to, because I've done this, and this is why I'm speaking to it. I've had people try to rush my healing. Oh, you need to do this. You got to do this. They literally tried to change my hair. They tried to change the way I was dressing. They wanted me to put on all this makeup. They wanted me to, oh, go do this, go do this. Oh, you need to take this class. You need, and all it did was show me what they wanted to conform me to be, but it wasn't really my healing journey, and all it did was push me further into the cave. So you need to recognize that, like, again, listener in Boston who said, how did she put it? She said, I should just get over it because it's been years. That's okay. The fact that you're recognizing it now is your first step to healing for you. And then know that your cave is not your final destination. Healing is your final destination, and you bringing along others on your healing process. And when I say healing process, I mean not that you bring in others in your healing journey with you, but that you're healed and now you're bringing along other people to say, hey, I'm healed. You can be healed too. Let me come alongside. So moving forward, one of the things I've noted about the Cave of Adullam is that, again, safety is found there, but we can't stay there. We gather strength there, but we can't stay there. And we were able to build community there in the cave, but we can't stay there. We need to be able to be safe, have strength, and have community outside of the cave. And that's the healthy way. That is when you know you are on your way to receiving healing because you are able to obtain these things, safety, strength, and community outside of the cave. You're trusting again. You're living life again. Sure, you may have memories of the trauma, but they won't affect you like they once did. And even if it does, you know how to handle it in a healthy way. So, whatever your cave looks like, your story doesn't end there. And we have to understand that moving out of the cave, I have some points here that I want to summarize here. It's learning new ways to feel safe, and that's going to be different for everybody. For me, one of the biggest things we're learning how to feel safe amongst other people. Again, I'm going to go ahead and talk about that more, but I ruined a lot of relationships because I didn't feel safe, even though they didn't do anything to me. But it was because of the baggage and the trauma that I was carrying. You build trust gradually. You find community with other survivors, and then you develop healthy boundaries. One of the things about sometimes with some of us trauma overcomers, but when we're still in survivor mode, so we become trauma survivors, we sometimes don't know how to set healthy boundaries. Boundaries are good. Boundaries bring about safety. And you have to understand that your boundary with one person is going to look different than your boundary with the next person. It's just how life is. Again, think about those of you that are married. The boundary that you have with your spouse may be really, really wide, really wide. But then one of your friends, your boundary may be right here, and that's okay. We have to learn to set those healthy boundaries. Sometimes we have no walls whatsoever, like none whatsoever. We have no boundaries, and that is also a challenge. Sometimes we have walls, and sometimes we have no boundaries. So we go from one extreme to the next, and we have to find that healthy balance. So your cave served its purpose. It kept you alive when survival was all you could manage. But just like David, you were made for more than survival. You are an overcomer. And when people introduce me and they say, when when people ask me to share my story and they want to introduce me and they say she's a trauma survivor or a sexual abuse survivor, I often, when I first begin to speak, I say, I'm no longer surviving, I'm overcoming. I am an overcomer. Um, and that's what I want it to look like for you as well. So this is what healing looks like. It doesn't mean you abandon the cave in one dramatic moment, but slowly, steadily, learning that we can be safe beyond walls. So that is it for the episode today. Next week, we are going to talk about forgiveness. That is a very hard topic for some, especially when it deals with um, childhood sexual abuse or trauma of any sort. When we talk about forgiveness, we tend to go to one extreme or the next. And I am going to break down what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not, and truly what it means for those of us who have walked through some kind of trauma. So until next time, thank you for joining me in Shattering the Silence.